Thank you for joining me on a very special program here. Not necessarily a very happy program for many people, but a very important one. Today, I want to talk about cooking and type 2 diabetes. Almost a year ago, I was diagnosed with somewhere between type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. I'm not quite sure where in that continuum I am. And I went ahead and did a bunch of research, reading through large amounts of scientific journals, as well as looking at what the consensus viewpoints were from medical communities in Germany, where I live, as well as in the United States, where I'm from. And so I wanted to start a series where we could talk about the science and the lifestyle implications of this particular illness. Now, we detect type 2 diabetes, or any diabetes, by looking at hyperglycemia, or too much glucose in the blood. So I figure it's probably worth starting this discussion by just providing a very basic account of blood sugar, what it is, why it's important, as well as insulin and some of the health problems that tend to come with poorly managed type 2 diabetes. Now, our cells, all of our cells in our body use energy. And most of the cells in our body can use energy from a variety of sources. Those sources can include glucose from the blood, can also include, in some cases, fat directly, and it can also sometimes include something called glycogen, which is basically polymerized glucose that's been stored. It's basically like a starch. There is, however, one organ in the body which is totally dependent on blood-borne glucose, and that's the brain. So, if your blood sugar drops too low, you die. If it drops a bit low, you will have trouble thinking, doing things, reacting, but that's all because of brain implications of hypoglycemia. So, unsurprisingly, we have hormones to control the amount of sugar in our blood. But where does that sugar come from? Sugar enters the blood actually from two sources. Most of the time, we think about it from the dietary source. In other words, we eat something, like a piece of rhubarb pie, or a piece of apple pie, or a piece of bread, and enzymes break that down into things that we can absorb. Now, starches are going to get broken down typically into glucose molecules, and those molecules will get basically absorbed into the bloodstream, and that will increase our blood glucose. But there's a second option also, and that's that we might need glucose in the blood when we haven't eaten anything. For example, when you're waking up in the morning. In order to accomplish this, the liver can release glucose into the blood, and it usually does so by metabolizing protein. So these are the two major sources of glucose in the blood. And consequently, when we think about having glucose that's too high, glucose is entering from those two, and then it's not being pulled out. Well, what pulls glucose out of the blood? Well, any cell which is capable of storing energy in a form other than glucose or ATP. ATP is the molecular fuel that's produced by the mitochondria that fuels the cell. The mitochondria are basically what metabolize other fuels into, like glucose, into ATP. But from external fuel, what I was going to say is most cells can store that. They can store it as glycogen, they can store it as fat. So, we have a hormone that controls that. That hormone is called insulin. It's produced in the pancreas by cells called beta cells, And when we think about diabetes, diabetes is the dysfunction and decline of those beta cells. So the beta cells produce insulin. If you're not producing enough insulin, then you will not be able to store energy properly. And this will cause a number of issues. People who don't manage their diabetes properly end up with heart issues, circulatory issues, including blood clotting, which can lead to strokes, heart attacks, and similar. You can end up with infections in the limbs that can become gangrenous and require amputations, loss of vision, a lot of things. And a lot of that is either directly inflammatory, or it's because inflammation can lead to blood clotting. It's also something that I think happens with COVID. So these are important things, and it's why we need to take things seriously. Now, when we talk about cooking, and I'll do another basically discussion piece later, when we talk about cooking with diabetes in mind, typically we're going to be interested in trying to make sure that the sugars that we absorb get absorbed slowly enough that we can store them with the amount of insulin that we produce. So this means cooking with more whole grains. It means using more whole sugars, less refined sugars, a lot of this sort of thing. The more we can do that, the fewer problems we have with blood sugar regulation from the diet. But that doesn't involve liver released glucose, and it doesn't address the issue of insulin resistance, which I'll talk about next time. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this. If you find it interesting, please subscribe. You'll get the rest of the series, which I think will be very important. Next time I'm going to be talking about the metabolic syndrome hypothesis of type 2 diabetes. This is an important framework to understand because it steered most of our research into this disease for the last 20 years. And it's something which is useful to understand in terms of understanding what you can do to minimize and even reverse what pieces of the disease may be reversible. And then from there I'll talk about other things. Stress management and why that's so important, and medication, and we'll have a whole series or a whole episode where we talk in more depth about food management, diet management, and how to take recipes and make them more diabetes friendly. So, thank you very much for watching. I'll be posting these up once a week, and I hope you find them useful.